you very much. From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as difficult as these questions may be, many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but have a lot more trouble identifying what they do believe. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the Enlightenment. Namely, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they've faded into the background as a kind of bland status quo or establishment. The other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I have tried to do in Enlightenment Now. The Enlightenment, I suggest, centers on 4 themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts, these are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you try to explain why you're right or why other people should believe you, when you insist that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. As a species, we are likely to generalize from anecdotes, to reason from stereotypes. We all seek information and evidence that confirms our beliefs, and we ignore evidence that disconfirms them. And we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment idea was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any beliefs about the world. The third ideal is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Now, you might think, enhancing human flourishing, who could be against that? Well, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopia or a messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. By default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our blood relatives, our close friends, our allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, including education, journalism, art, mobility, and reason. I can't, as soon as I engage in any kind of discourse or debate or conversation with you, I can't insist that only my interests are special because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Finally, we get to the ideal of progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, one could ask, if human nature doesn't change, how could progress be possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is that it's possible through benign institutions. Institutions that allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to push back against entropy, disorder, decay, that magnify the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln put it, namely reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our thirst for dominance and vengeance. What do I mean by Enlightenment institutions? Well, some of the institutions that we continue to enjoy this day include democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, a free press, and literary festivals, for that matter. So 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, for many people, the question of whether progress has taken place is a matter of whether you are an optimist or a pessimist. Do you wear rose-colored glasses? Do you see the glass as half full? But in Enlightenment now, I suggest that is not the way to ask the question of whether we have seen progress in the last 250 years. Rather, we should think of progress as an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. We can measure life and health and prosperity and safety and peace and knowledge and leisure and happiness. If they have increased over time, I suggest that would be progress. Well, let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years. But then, with the invention of vaccination, of sanitation, later of antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy at birth for the world as a whole has increased to 71 years. And virtually no one guesses that it's that high. In Europe, it's more than 80 years, and similarly in the Americas. But Asia has made tremendous progress, and life expectancy has soared to more than 70 years. Even sub-Saharan Africa, the world's poorest region, has shown fantastic increases in life expectancy. For most of history, the biggest contributor to low life expectancy was child mortality, the death of children and babies in their vulnerable years. In Sweden, 250 years ago, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought the rate of child mortality down by a factor of 100, and other parts of the world followed the same trajectory. In North America, Canada, in East Asia, South Korea, in Latin America, Chile, and in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, whose rate of child mortality has fallen from 25% just 30 years ago to 6% today. It's still too high, but the progress is continuing. Mothers, too, were highly vulnerable to death when giving birth. In Sweden, 250 years ago, 1% of women died in childbirth. The chance of death was 1% for each child being born. That has fell in Sweden by a factor of 250. Likewise in the United States, in Malaysia, and in Ethiopia. Health. For most of history, the major cause of early death in humans was infectious disease. In rich countries, such as North America and Europe, infectious disease is no longer a major threat to health. But in poorer countries, it continues to claim the lives of millions of people each year, especially children. But for each of the 5 most lethal infectious diseases, there has been huge reduction in mortality just in the last 20 years. Pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed an active adult male, and most countries, for most of history, were unable to grow that many calories until the British agricultural revolution in the 18th century, with the development of advances in agronomy, such as crop rotation and better plows, the invention of synthetic fertilizer in the early 20th century, the mechanization of agriculture, which allowed food to be taken from the regions that grew it to the cities where most of the people were, and the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, such as in the Green Revolution of the 1960s. As a result, England was the first country to grow enough calories to feed itself, followed by other countries such as the United States and France, and China and India have shown tremendous advances just in the last 40 years. India was known, especially in the West, as the land of famine, but famines in India have been drastically reduced. India, as you all know, now exports food and has drastically reduced the rate of hunger and undernourishment. There you have the graph for the world as a whole. If all of these extra calories were just going to make people fatter, then this would be a dubious example of progress. But in fact, as I hinted, the extra calories are reducing the rate of undernourishment. In 1970, more than 1/3 of people in the developing world were undernourished. That has been cut in half to less than 15%. The advance was first enjoyed by Latin America, then Asia, including South Asia, as you can see, and more recently, Sub-Saharan Africa is showing progress. The most extreme human cost of insufficient calories occurs during famines. Famines used to take place anywhere in the world and could kill by the millions, but now famines occur only in parts of the world that are extremely remote or are racked by war. Famine is not a question of not being able to grow enough food, it's a question of being able to get it to the people who need it, and that can be disrupted during wartime. Prosperity. For most of history, there was little to no economic growth. We can see this in a graph of the gross world product from the year 1 to the year 2015. And as the graph shows, for more than 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. But then with the Industrial Revolution, with advances in energy capture, the spread of education, the development of financial institutions such as markets and banks, and the globalization of trade, gross world product has increased by a factor of 200 just in the last 200 years. Now, again, the growth of prosperity was highly uneven across the regions of the world. The first parts of the world to make the great escape from universal poverty were in Europe and North America. But more recently, East Asian countries like South Korea have advanced spectacularly. Latin American countries like Chile, and here we see China and India. India does not look very impressive on this graph, but it is showing exponential growth. And in fact, the gross domestic product per capita, a measure of overall income, in India today is what it was in Sweden about 100 years ago. So India still has a long way to go, but of course India has probably 20 times as many people now as Sweden had 100 years ago, and India is showing exponential growth. Again, growth and prosperity would be a dubious form of progress if all of the gains were just going to the 1%. But in fact, they have been going to reduce the rate of extreme poverty worldwide. In 1820, 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. That has been reduced to less than 10%. In fact, there's been a 75% reduction in the global rate of extreme poverty just in the last 30 years, and some economists call this the greatest achievement in human history. According to a report from the Brookings Institute that came out last month, a majority of people in the world today are middle class for the first time in history. Because poor countries have been getting richer faster than rich countries have been getting richer, international inequality, that is the gap between rich countries and poor countries, has been shrinking. Now, it had to increase with the Industrial Revolution, starting at a time in which all countries were poor. A few countries started to get rich, such as England and the United States, opening up a gap and leaving the rest behind, stuck in traditional poverty. But now that economic development is making poor countries richer, the inequality index has now turned a corner and is starting to decline. Now, in rich countries like the United States, of course, inequality has increased rather than decreasing, but that doesn't mean that rich countries have been indifferent to the fate of the poor and the needy. 150 years ago, no country spent more than about 1.5% of its GDP on social transfers. That is spending on the poor, on children, on the elderly, and on the sick. But in the 20th century, every developed country went on a binge of social spending, so that today the median among OECD countries is 22% of GDP gets redistributed in social spending. India, like other developing countries, as it gets wealthier, is starting to allocate more of its wealth to social programs to help the less well-off. There's a general tendency in human history, sometimes called Wagner's Law, that as countries become more prosperous, they spend more of their wealth in social redistribution. As a result, in countries like the United States, the rate of poverty, when measured in terms of income after taxes and transfers, that is, taking government benefits into account, poverty has fallen from 1/3 in 1960 to 7% today. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, that is, the food, clothing, and shelter that people can afford to buy, taking into account falling prices, it's fallen from 30% to 3%. Peace. For most of history, the natural state of relations between great countries and empires was war. And peace was just an interlude, a brief interlude between wars. We can see that in a graph showing the percentage of years that the great powers of the day, the major states and empires, fought each other in wars. What the graph shows is that 300 years ago, the world's great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, they are never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in Korea 65 years ago. Now, if we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that even though wars were becoming less common, two of the wars that did occur wreaked massive human damage, namely World War I and World War II. But contrary to predictions that I grew up with, many people in this room grew up with, that it's only a matter of time before we would see a third world war pitting the United States against the Soviet Union, fought with nuclear weapons and killing even more people than the two world wars. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union went out of existence, World War III never happened. In fact, if we now zoom in on the period since World War II, we see there's been a dramatic decline in the rate of death in wars of all kinds, including civil wars and colonial wars. It's been an uneven decline. There were peaks for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Syrian Civil War, but nonetheless the trend has been tremendously downward, from 22 war deaths per 100,000 per year in the 1950s to 1.2 last year. Freedom and rights. Despite the threats to democracy that we have all read about in countries such as Turkey and Venezuela and Russia and Poland, the overall trend has been enormously in the direction of democracy. That is, if you give every country a score from -10 to +10, depending on how autocratic or democratic it is, and you count them up, including both the countries that have gotten more democratic and less democratic, then you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this past decade. Of course, I'm speaking in the world's largest democracy, and India is far from unique in the developing world, or in the developed world for that matter, in embracing democracy. If you think back to the 1970s, when I was a college student, half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and ruled by communist totalitarian dictatorships. Almost all of Latin America was ruled by military governments. In East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, Indonesia, all led by military dictatorships, all of them democratic today. Also, the power of governments to brutalize their citizens has been in decline. One example is the abolition of the death penalty, where country after country has abolished the death penalty. If current trends continue, this is no guarantee that they will, the death penalty will have vanished from the face of the earth in 2026, joining other institutions that have been abolished, such as legal slavery. And countries have been decriminalizing victimless crimes like homosexuality. This is a graph of the countries that have decriminalized homosexuality, and as you all know, India took this step just 3 months ago, joining a general world tendency. Child labor. For most of history, children were sent to work in farms and factories. In 1850 in England, about 30% of children were in the labor market. That has fallen to the single digits or less. Because of general affluence, when people don't depend on the labor of their children, they'd rather have them in school. The premium that modern societies place on education, making children more valuable in school than they would be in factories and farms, and a general increase in the valuation of the lives of children. This process was repeated in other European countries, such as in Italy, and there you have a graph for the world as a whole. In 2015, the Nobel Peace Prize went to Kailash Satyarthi for it was shared by him, for his efforts in reducing child labor worldwide, and the two black lines on the graph show that his efforts have brought about true progress. Violent crime. In any part of the world that lives in a state of anarchy, there will be predation and raiding and feuding in retaliation and general high rates of violence. For example, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the overall homicide rate was about 33 per 100,000 per year. But then with the growth of medieval kingdoms and the consolidation of the feudal patchwork of baronies and fiefs and principalities, the king's justice was extended through these newly formed countries, and the rate of violent crime fell dramatically. In Europe today, the violent crime rate or the homicide rate is 1 per 100,000 per year. That is 1/35th of what it was in the Middle Ages. This process is replicated in any part of the world in which the government brings frontier regions under control, and the code of vendetta and blood revenge and feuding is replaced by the court system and a rule of law. It happened in the United States in colonial New England, it happened in the American Wild West, and it happened in Mexico, a country that still has a high rate of homicide, but it's still less than half of what it was a century ago. If we zoom in just on the last 50 years or so, we see that in countries like the United States, which underwent a boom in crime in the 1960s, has subsequently brought that crime rate under control, and the world as a whole has seen about a 35% reduction in the homicide rate just in the last 20 years. In the United States, at least, and in many European countries, the rate of violence against women has been brought down, such as domestic violence against wives and girlfriends, and the rates of rape and sexual assault. And of course, Americans are fully aware of the high rate of violence against women in India, but also in the efforts to confront that problem and to bring those rates down. Based on the experience of the United States, which used to have a rate of rape that was 3 times higher than what it is today, there is reason to believe that if an effort is made to reduce violence against women, those efforts can succeed. It is not a permanent feature of a society to have high rates of violence against women. The same is true of violence against children. Again, these data are from the United States, where rates of victimizing children in school, such as bullying, have come down in the last 25 years, and rates of physical abuse and sexual abuse. Also, as we know, serious problems in India, but again, if there is an effort to reduce them, the countries that have applied those measures have made great progress. Safety. We've been getting safer in just about every way. Thanks to improvements in the design of automobiles, in the enforcement of traffic laws in the United States, and all of these data are going to come from the United States. Americans are 96% less likely to be killed in a car crash, 88% less likely to be killed on the sidewalk as pedestrians, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to their deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die by fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated by gas or poison vapor. But there is an exception to this trend of increasing safety in the United States, and that is deaths from poison, solid or liquid. And what this graph shows includes all drug overdoses, and here you see the American opioid epidemic, an exception to the trend of increasing safety. At the same time, Americans are 95% less likely to be killed on the job, and people worldwide, these are data that come from the entire globe, are less likely to die in a so-called act of God, a natural disaster such as droughts, floods, wildfires, volcanoes, meteor strikes, and earthquakes, presumably not because God is any less angry with us, but because of advances in prediction of threats, in the resilience of infrastructure, and in emergency response systems. What about the ultimate quintessential act of God, the projectile hurled from on high by Zeus. Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humanity is to be illiterate, and in 15th century Europe, literacy was a privilege that was confined only to the wealthy. Only 15% of people could read and write. But then by the 20th century, Europe and the United States achieved universal literacy, and the rest of the world is catching up. Today, 80% of the world can read and write, 90% of the world under the age of 25. Not just men, but women. In England in 1750, only 6 women could read and write for every 10 men who could, but England achieved universal literacy by the 19th century. And the world as a whole is very close. The world is almost at gender parity for literacy. Even the most backward countries when it comes to educating girls, Pakistan and Afghanistan, have shown quite dramatic increases. For that, we have to thank, at least symbolically, the other winner of the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize, Malala Yousafzai. And in perhaps the most unbelievable, incredible, astonishing example of progress that I have found, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented phenomenon called the Flynn Effect, IQ scores have been increasing all over the world by about 3 points a decade, so we score 30 points higher on IQ tests than our grandparents and great-grandparents did a century ago. This is a gift of the spread of education and of the trickling down of abstract technical concepts from science and technology and academia into everyday life. Well, do any of these advances improve the quality of our life? And the answer is they do. At least as countries get richer, the work hours start to shrink. In England and the United States, 150 years ago, the typical work week was 62 hours. Today it is 40 hours, and a typical worker in the United States and Europe gets 3 weeks of paid vacation, which would have been inconceivable in the 19th century. Also, because of the universal penetration of running water and electricity, at least in rich countries like in Europe and the United States, and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we waste on housework, which people indicate is the least favorite way of spending their time, has decreased from 60 hours a week to 15 hours a week. Thanks to the shortening of the work week and the reduction in the amount of time we spend on housework, the amount of leisure time in the United States has increased since the 1960s, both for men and for women. Now, you will notice that this graph levels off for women, that the progress stopped. The reason is that American women today spend more time with their children. In fact, a single working mother today in the United States spends more hours with her children than a married stay-at-home mother did in the 1950s. And we spend less of our paycheck on necessities, from 60% 100 years ago to 33% today. Well, doesn't all of this make us any happier? These are all things that economists like to measure and tabulate, but does it ultimately improve the most important thing of all, how happy we are? The answer is, in general, it does. As countries get wealthier, their citizens tend to get happier. This is a graph that is plotted on a logarithmic scale, which shows that as the richer the country, the happier its people. Within every country, as indicated by the arrow impaling each dot, the richer people are happier. Remember, this is a logarithmic scale, which means that an extra dollar, an extra rupee, makes a poor person much more happy than it does a rich person. But nonetheless, the relationship holds across the scale, and it suggests that as countries get richer, their people should get happier. As best we can tell, that is true for the 50 countries for which we have happiness data over time. 86% have shown an increase, including India. 25 years ago, about 70% of Indians said they were happy. Today, 80% of Indians say that they're happy. Now, India, compared to other countries, is not among the world's happiest. In fact, in a ranking of 156 countries, India came in 133rd, because India is still, on the whole, not a wealthy country. On the other hand, Indians are among the world's most optimistic people. If you ask people, not are you happy, but do you think your life will get better, then a majority of Indians say yes. By the way, that is not true of rich countries. In countries like the United States and France and England and Germany, about 5% of people say that their lives will get better. In India, a majority of people say their lives will get better. Has all this progress come at the expense of the environment? And the answer is, it surely has. However, as countries get richer, they tend to care more about the environment. Again, this should be pretty obvious in a city like Mumbai. If your first priority is economic growth, then the environment is a lower priority. People would rather have electricity and smog than clean air and no electricity. But then as countries get rich, they start to devote some of their wealth to getting clean air together with electricity. And their values change. In wealthier countries, people put a higher value on the environment. They pass laws. They develop technology to protect the air and the water. So I'll show you data from the United States. Since the 1970, when the United States passed the Clean Air Act and implemented and formed the Environmental Protection Agency, even though the American population increased by 50%, GDP increased by 2.5%, and Americans drive twice as many miles as they did in 1970. At the same time, the rate of pollution from the 5 major air pollutants have declined an average of 60%. So it is not true that you have to choose between economic growth on the one hand and clean air on the other. As countries develop, they tend to pursue both. Even though there are huge threats to the environment, worldwide, out of 178 out of 180 countries have seen improvements in the quality of the environment over the last 10 years. There has, for example, been in temperate countries, a decrease in deforestation to pretty much zero as farms have been abandoned because agriculture has been more efficient, more food is grown on less land, and the forests are taking back area that used to be farmland in the United States and Europe. In tropical regions, deforestation continues, alarmingly, but even in the tropical world, the rate of deforestation has peaked and is coming back down. And we can hope that progress is not reversed in Brazil by the new president, Bolsonaro. And the amount of the world's surface that is protected against economic exploitation has doubled, both areas on land and marine protected areas. Most generally, the biggest threat to the environment, many people believe, comes from expanding population, and there were fears, especially in the 1960s, that the world's population would just keep growing exponentially, resulting in massive famines. But the massive famines, as I mentioned before, did not take place. In fact, the rate of famine has been drastically reduced, and the rate of population increase has come down. This graph shows the population growth rate up to over the last 250 years and extrapolated into the future. And the rate of population growth tends to decrease as societies become richer, as they become better educated, as they become more urbanized, and as women become more empowered and they take control of their own reproduction. As a result, it's quite possible, given trends in economic growth and in women's rights and in education, that the world's population will peak at about 9 billion in the year 2070. And that will take at least some of the pressure off the environment. Well, I hope to have convinced you that the world has, despite the rather frightening headlines that we read every day, by measures of human well-being, health, life, prosperity, education, leisure, and so on, there has been tremendous progress, especially over the last 70 years or so. So how has the fact of human progress been reflected in the news? I'll show you another graph. This one shows the emotional tone of the news, calculated by an algorithm called sentiment mapping, which tallies the percentage of positive and negative words in news stories. And it shows that during all of these years in which the world has gotten safer and more peaceful and richer and healthier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose and glum, and so has a summary of the world's broadcasts. So why is there this discrepancy? Why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from our psychology. Cognitive psychologists refer to a phenomenon in our minds called the availability heuristic. That is, that people estimate risk and probability according to how easily they can recall examples from memory. We use our brain's search engine as a way of estimating probability. Well, the problem is, combine that with the nature of news. News is about stuff that happens, not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, "I'm reporting live from a country that is at peace," or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. Also, bad things can happen very quickly. A terrorist attack, a war, an epidemic, a collapse of a building. But good things aren't built in a day, and they creep up gradually. For example, the newspapers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. Also, there is something of a negativity bias in the news, that journalists feel it is their mission to prevent people from sinking into complacency. There is an American humor newspaper called The Onion that runs satirical headlines, and they captured this phenomenon in a joke headline, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of human cognitive psychology with the nature of journalism, you can see why the world is coming to an end, and always has been. There's another feature of our psychology that makes us receptive to warnings about danger, called the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good, psychologically speaking. We dread losses more than we anticipate gains, and we think and feel about bad events more than good events, especially recent bad events. With the passage of time, the negative experience of our memories tends to fade. We are wired for nostalgia, which is why Franklin Pierce Adams said, "Nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory." There's also market forces in prophets, in predictors, in social commentators, where pessimism sounds serious. A pessimist sounds like he's trying to help you. Optimism sounds frivolous. An optimist sounds like he's trying to sell you something. Well, let me conclude with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I suspect have occurred to many of you. First is, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to speak truth to power, to rake the muck, and to prevent ourselves from falling into complacency? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we need to know about danger and risk and suffering and injustice, But we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced, because there are dangers to indiscriminate, thoughtless pessimism. Even if there's a danger of complacency if we are not aware of the problems, the danger of thinking that everything is getting worse include fatalism. If things get worse and worse, no matter what people do, no matter how much people try to make the world a better place, all of their efforts fail, the natural reaction is, why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? As Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. And if you think that we're doomed, if you think that if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway robots and artificial intelligence will, the natural reaction is, well, let's just enjoy ourselves while we can. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The other danger is radicalism. If you think that all of our institutions are failing and are beyond any hope of reform, you will be open to demagogues who promise to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, or who promise, only I can fix it, a sentence that brings a chill to every American who remembers what happened 2 years ago. Is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems, and problems are inevitable. Solutions, moreover, create new problems which must be solved in their turn. Also, even against a backdrop of steady progress, there can be nasty surprises, and I've shown you a number just this morning: the world wars, the 1960s crime boom in America and Europe, AIDS in Africa, and the American opioid epidemic. And the world faces severe challenges which have not been solved. Foremost among them are climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I discuss these in detail in Enlightenment Now, and I suggest that we must treat these as problems that are unsolved but solvable rather than apocalypses in waiting. We must deal with the threat of climate change by decarbonizing the world's economy, via a combination of policy, namely carbon pricing, and technology, namely low, zero, and negative, eventually negative carbon technologies, including renewables, nuclear, and carbon capture. We should denuclearize international relations by increasing strategic stability to reduce the chance of a misunderstanding or an accident, and by a program of arms limitation and reduction, culminating in the goal of eliminating all nuclear weapons across the entire planet, a goal that has been increasingly embraced even by the leaders of the Cold War, such as Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, who have now adopted the goal of zero for nuclear weapons. Barack Obama, the American president, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 in part by committing the United States to that goal. Just a couple of indications that these are not hopeless. They are not going to happen automatically, but they are not romantic or utopian, is the fact that economies tend to go through an arc of carbon intensity, that is, how much CO2 they emit per dollar of GDP. We can see this, for example, in the UK and the US. When the Industrial Revolution began, these countries burned massive amounts of coal to capture energy, but then transitioned from coal to oil, to natural gas, to hydro, to renewables, and to nuclear, and so we're able to produce more wealth with less CO2. It happened in China, although with some huge spikes because of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, which resulted in massive carbon emissions and zero economic output until China came back to its senses. And in India, we see there's been an increase, but India has now turned a corner and is using less CO2 per amount of wealth generated. Now, these curves do not mean that the world is on track to solving the problem of climate change. for two reasons. One of them is this is CO2 emitted per dollar of GDP, but of course, as I showed you before, GDP is going way up, and what counts is just the amount of CO2. And it's not enough that these curves be reduced, they have to go to zero. But nonetheless, the fact that there is this arc suggests that modern economies and the generation of wealth is not inherently tied to burning carbon. And a little known fact that the world's nuclear arsenal has been reduced by 85% since its peak during the Cold War. Again, this is like many of these examples of progress, they are threatened by some of the current world trends, such as authoritarian populists like Putin and Trump. Trump is threatening to do away with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty, which threatens to undo some of this progress. But what this graph shows is that the world can make progress if we hold our leaders responsible to continuing it. My final question: does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism just arid or tepid or flattened, as some critics say? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. We know that secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, and they are the top destination for people who vote with their feet. And also, I would argue that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, maybe even spiritual. Because this is a hero story that is not just a myth, but is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a heroic story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient creature with the ability to flourish and the desire to persist in its being and the power of reason. And it depends on nothing more than the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, peace is better than war, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I don't believe we have time for questions, or do we? Just a few, yes. Yes. No, the woman on the inside, I think, no, the young woman next to you is the first one that I recognize, please. Yes. Take the microphone, please.
How do you think we can use the principles of enlightenment to see problems like companies like Amazon and Facebook? And also, as much as literacy rates have gone up, that's taught us to read, but the content that comes to us is increasingly tailored. The kind of content that we get, and that we think a certain way because of the books that we get, the articles that we get, and our textbooks are largely incorrect as well. So how do we look at these problems?
I'm sorry, how we look at the processes of what? I didn't quite hear the question.
The content that comes on our phones because of algorithms, the kinds of articles that we get, because literacy, at least over here, is teaching us to read, but how do we learn to think? And companies like Amazon and Facebook, how do you see these principles being used to frame those problems?
Yes. Well, one of the trends that I would like to encourage, that I think it needs much more emphasis in journalism, the media, education, intellectual life, but then should spread and just become common knowledge, is that we should base our understanding of the world not on headlines, not on stories, not on images, but much more on data. Because we know that images, stories, narratives, anecdotes can be highly misleading. They can be selected from the worst things that happen, and all of the good things that happen, or bad things that don't happen, just are never news stories. whereas data count up both the countries that are at war and the countries that are at peace, the number of people who are killed and the number of people who are not killed, and that is a better window of understanding onto the world than what we get on our devices or in our newspapers. This is I don't want to call it a revolution, it's too soon to call it a revolution, but it is an insight that comes from cognitive psychology, from the discoveries that the human brain is systematically distorted in its view of the world because of images, stories, stereotypes. There are more and more people who are becoming aware of this problem in human cognition. There was a bestseller called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman that some of you may be familiar with. There are groups of younger people who form communities like the rationality community, the effective altruism community, who are dedicated to using numbers and facts and data and logic and analysis to have a more accurate understanding of the world. And I would like for that movement to spread and become more and more popular. Yes?
Professor Pinker, why, in your opinion, are we living today in a world of leaders where there's not a single one you can look up to? And I'm not being pessimistic, I hope I'm being accurate.
Well, who you look up to, of course, depends on your own values, and we are. The complaint that we can't look up to leaders is one, by the way, that is heard in every generation. What happened to the heroes of yesteryear? But in their time, leaders that today we look back on as highly successful were hated in their time. John F. Kennedy just barely was elected and even though it was popular in some segments of the population, was also hated by the American right. He's become a saint after he was killed, but was very controversial in his time. Barack Obama, again in the United States. Winston Churchill was voted out of office the first election after World War II. Of course, not necessarily a hero in India in the first place, but even which actually, again, proves I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes our heroes are very selective. And in general, we shouldn't have heroes as political leaders. We should have policies, we should have laws, we should have norms that make people better off. And it can be, I think, seductive to try to put too much hope in the virtue and charisma of a leader. We really need general changes in policy and in norms.
So you posited that secular liberal democracies are in a way a solution to a lot of the issues which you've discussed. But a lot of the patterns which you've discussed about myth making and about believing in the tribe and all, we see them basically being replicated in democracies as well. I mean, of course, now taking into account the government has less power to abuse people and people are freer and quality of life is better, but the same patterns are actually being replicated in democracies when people just elect the same thing and it goes on. So how do you deal with that if democracies are the solution to a lot of these problems, and how do you deal with that aspect?
Well, I'm a very strong believer in the existence of human nature that does not change, including tendencies toward tribalism, toward authoritarianism, towards magical thinking and superstition. And it is possible for politicians to capitalize on those features of human nature. The question is, can we have a system of institutions and laws and norms that are robust against the threats posed by authoritarian leaders? The answer for this decade is we don't yet know. We certainly hope so. But even in the reactionary policies that leaders like Trump and Orban have been proposing, you don't see them succeeding in turning back the clock. So in the United States, for example, there is not a return to racial segregation, which we had in the 1960s. There isn't a return to laws that keep women out of the workplace. There isn't a recriminalization of homosexuality. There's certain trends that are stronger than individual leaders. At the edge, at the cutting edge of progress, there's always pushback, but if the norms and laws and institutions are in place and they're robust enough, they can survive the assault by these authoritarian leaders. And I think in the long-term future, despite the moment that we're living through, where authoritarian leaders have been making inroads in many countries, the long-term trajectory is pushing, I think will push against them. Because the popularity of authoritarian populist leaders comes from rural areas, and the world is getting more urban. It comes from less educated voters, and the world is getting more educated. And it comes from older voters, and we know what happens to old people. They die and are replaced by younger people. And the younger cohorts now are less supportive of authoritarian populism than the older ones. So over the long term, I don't think that the authoritarianism we're seeing now, even though it has become popular, is the wave of the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have today.
I'm sorry, I don't know where that voice is coming from, but we'll take another question. Yes. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. I take it from your wonderful presentation that the elements of science, reason, etc. are the cause and the effect is human development indices that you have cited. If that assumption is true, then looking at the way identity-driven polarization is all around us, and if you are asked to extrapolate or project the future of human development indices, would you say that there will be a deceleration in the coming years?
We'll say there is what?
There will be a deceleration, the slowdown of development of human indices in the coming years, coming decades.
I didn't catch that word. Will there be what?
Will there be a slowdown? Will there be a deceleration, opposite of acceleration?
Oh, deceleration.
Yeah.
It depends on the measure that we're looking at. Economic growth in the rate of acceleration has come down, especially in the developed world, and in rich countries like Europe and America don't have the same rates of economic growth that they had in the 50s and 60s. But in poorer countries, the rate is likely to remain high, and for the world as a whole. So it's not. I don't think it's going to decelerate, although the rate of acceleration will be reduced. There's no reason to think that technological and scientific progress will slow down. In fact, if anything, they seem to be accelerating. But since the progress that we've enjoyed has not just been a matter of science and technology, one of the Enlightenment values that I listed in this talk and in the subtitle was humanism. That is, deploying our knowledge, our technology, and our science to the goal of making people better off, giving people longer lives, happier lives, healthier lives, better educated lives. It is also crucial that we retain that as our top value, as opposed to national glory, as opposed to economic growth at all costs, regardless of how it's distributed, as opposed to religious precepts. As I mentioned, there are alternatives to humanism, and together with the scientific and technological advances, we have to have the commitment to use those advances to make humanity better off. So hard to predict, but I think there is reason to think that it will continue.
Ladies